And we are now recording. Okay. All right. So this is Zoom In, the first video in a series that I'm hoping to do featuring women throughout Vancouver Island. It's called Zoom In, and the Vancouver Island University Faculty Association Status of Women Committee is hosting this series. And I want to thank you, Joy, for being the first person to join in this video series. We're going to have a little bio about you underneath the video so that people can read about you. But of course, you and I have been friends for quite some time and also colleagues at VIU. I'm in the English department and you're in media studies and also in creative writing and journalism. And also you've served as the chair for the Status of Women Committee for the Faculty Association for several years. And have been really influential and helpful to me as I've also taken on that role as chair of the committee. So thanks again for being here. And I'm just, would you mind if we just dig right into the questions?
No, my pleasure. Fire away.
Okay, great. So as you know, I've been thinking about this, and research suggests that those first 5 years of childhood are pivotal in terms of shaping who we are as people. And I know that you've had a pretty interesting childhood, and I'm wondering if you can share with our viewers a bit about what your childhood was like and how you think it's shaped you in terms of who you are today.
Well, that's a good first question, and I do love telling this story because even though I had nothing to do with my origins in some ways, none of us do, I do really fondly recall the first 4.5 years of my life because they were in Nepal. And my parents were development workers. My dad was an engineer building suspension bridges in the jungle, the far west part of the Terai in Nepal, which is sort of southwest of Everest, and the Pokhara Annapurna range as well. And then my mom was teaching English as a second language. So my mom was pregnant when they went there and flew through Germany from Canada and Montreal to Kathmandu, and then again to Tansen, which is a small place, and landed to a rickshaw and a drive into a small area that was in sort of north of the Chitwan, which is now kind of an elephant reserve and known for that. And it was a small compound where a bunch of other development workers worked, and was a mud house that was shared with 9 other Nepali workers at this institute where my father was going to be working on the bridges. And it was monsoon season when I was born in June, and I had to go up to a hospital. My mom went up to a hospital. I was 3 weeks late, have been late ever since, which she never stops reminding me of. And I was born in this hospital where the doctor had only done one other cesarean, and it was going to be by cesarean. It was a tin roof with the rains just pounding on it and the lights swinging over the operating table. And I was born, my dad came back up the mountain in a mudslide to see me just as I was born. And such was the dramatic beginning. So I love that story, of course, and have been told it many times, partially because when our family moved back to Canada, my brother was born there too, 3 years later, almost to the day. And when we went back to Canada, my parents had to do quite a lot of kind of consciousness raising in the community, and they did presentations at libraries and churches and various halls and basements. And I was always dragged along as Exhibit A because both my parents had to talk. And so I've seen the slides so many times of those first 4 or 5 years that I feel like I remember them in a way that most children wouldn't, right? Because we're really remembering the slides. But the trip back was even more informative of who I am, because that's the moment I think that I return to when I think about the world of travel, which I have engaged in the last 30, 40 years, but also my hopes for retirement, it all involve travel. So my parents drove from Kathmandu to Stuttgart, Germany, which is through terrain that of course you could never traverse now, and across many borders that are closed. And my 4th birthday was in Kandahar. All I wanted to do was go swimming and have a cake, and neither of those things were really possible. And my parents were camping. It was like the circus coming to town, these 4 white people out of an orange Volkswagen van.
Wow.
And I was blonde as a child, and so was my
Really?
brother.
Wow.
And so it was unusual that for 3.5 months we would go through the Asian Highway and the Khyber Pass. And my parents documented it with a lot of photos and a diary that my mom since turned into a memoir, and I got to edit it. So in lots of ways, those first few years were really formative to my love of travel and exploration and other cultures. And I'm so grateful, even though I had nothing to do with the decision, to benefit from it.
Wow.
What about you? You've also traveled and explored different parts of North America and elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting you say that, because we didn't travel at all as kids, and we were at home a lot. And I think one of the most formative experiences that I had in travel was when my mom got sick, actually, with cancer, and I was about 21 years old. And I grew up with my mom as a single mom, and she graduated high school as an adult, as a returning adult, and was valedictorian of her graduation. And so I kind of witnessed her as this very strong minded, independent person. And it's funny because of seeing her as a single mother, I didn't always see the barriers that she faced. I kind of saw this person who knew how to advocate for herself and stood up for herself. That was the version of my mom that I saw. I came to realize there were many versions of my mom as I grew up and also spoke to other family members and so on. But that was the version I was lucky enough to see. But when she got sick, I saw this fragility in her that I never pictured in her. And so it kind of reminded me of this sort of, on the one hand, this taken for granted sense that, of course, I have the right and obligation to ask questions, to ask for things, to speak up. And I've always felt that in me. But then that kind of threw me down on my butt, to so to speak, when I saw that a lot of that can be taken away from you very quickly. And it's really important to have like unconditional support around you if possible. And so the first trip I really ever took was, and I wasn't even expecting to really get into this, but was to go to Mexico with my mom. And we stayed in San Isidro, which is this little border town near San Diego. And every single day we crossed the border into Tijuana, and she took this alternative medicine. And it was because she was told basically that nothing else could help her in terms of regular treatment. And so we did this, and it was just sort of like a frontline experience of border control, a frontline experience of people who are sort of desperate in their last stages of life, trying to find something that will help them stay alive. And this sort of real awakening for me. And I think in terms of travel, what it did put into me was this desire to absolutely travel as much as possible, because that was the one thing my mom always wanted to do, and she never ever got to do it. So with some inheritance, modest inheritance from her, I went on to do quite a bit of traveling. And it happened to be that really nobody in my life was able to travel with me at the time. And I thought, I can't wait for people to be ready to travel. I'm just going to go do it. And so most of my travel experiences are when I look back at them, are me saying, hey, Melissa, do you remember when you did that? Because I don't really have a person to talk to about them. But they consisted of things like volunteer work overseas in places like Guyana and Vanuatu. In some cases, it was just sort of Europe, traveling checking out the cities and so on. And then in other cases, it was in South America, doing sort of eco tourism and stuff like that. But kind of made it that a commitment early on to do that since she passed. And I don't regret it, because I certainly learned a lot from it. I know that your childhood obviously began in this really global way, and you subsequently went on to do travels as well. And I'm just wondering if you can build on that. Like, how has that shaped you, and where have you been?
Well, I did have somebody to travel with, usually a close female friend or a boyfriend, or in some cases, family members. But most of my trips were focused around meeting somebody who lived abroad or starting there and then going off on my own and exploring. So I have, for 4 summers between my years at journalism school at Carleton, I traveled from the last day of my exam to the day before we came back. So a solid 4.5 months. And I usually worked somewhere in Europe for about 2 months and then traveled for 2 months. So a lot of it was in the era of the Eurail pass and the under 25. I think you needed to be kind of free coupon around Europe to see as much of it as possible. And I did that the first couple of years. And then I also did a lot of hitchhiking, which I am not recommending to our viewers
Right.
necessarily. But I managed through a few scrapes here and there to get through it fairly well. And I had, kind of strange jobs, working as a lifeguard at a water slide park in London, or working at as a waitress in Portugal, in Faro, in the
Oh,
southern
really?
part of the Algarve.
Wow.
And I could speak French and English, a little bit of German. I picked up a little bit of Portuguese. And I faked it till I made it, basically, for a couple of months. I got paid under the table, therefore badly. And I often didn't really pre-think what it was going to cost to get around in all of these places, certainly lots more now. But we made it work on really low sums of money. And then when I had started working and had more money, I went back. But I also went to places like Egypt, where my friend Barbara Plett was the BBC correspondent for television and radio. And so I met her in Cairo. I visited a friend who was working for a sort of social justice organization in South Africa. And so I went to Johannesburg and spent some time there, and in Cape Town with her. And I traveled to, not to places that I sort of thought I must go here on my bucket list, but where are the people living that I'm only going to have an experience of seeing while they're there. And they are such great local tour guides that they can show me the off the beaten path version of it. And I did go back to Nepal when I was 30, almost the same age that my mom was when she had me, and traveled in Thailand at the same time. And I've been to Vietnam, where I adopted my son, Quinn. And that was, of course, the trip of a lifetime for obvious reasons. So I haven't traveled as much in Asia and Africa as I have in Europe. And I did have one amazing trip in Patagonia, hiking in Argentina and Chile, and going to Buenos Aires, which is also an incredible city. And all of these things, I think, really shaped me in that they reminded you how small you are, how big the world is, how much your privilege can be taken for granted, how rich the world's views are, how much we have in common, how important it is to listen, to be in the minority and learn that you are not an exception. You are someone who has as much to learn as anyone else, despite how much education you think you have. And it was an incredibly humbling and enlightening experience. And I sometimes joke, that every Canadian student should, upon graduation from high school, be given this train ticket across Canada to experience our country and the diversity that we have between our own borders. But in an ideal world, we would all be given tickets, to volunteer somewhere around the world, and to just come out of our comfort zone, because I think a huge part of what travel gives you is empathy, and the world needs it now more than ever. Has that been your experience as well when you've traveled, that I'm just thinking about how it informs our teaching as well?
Actually, it's funny you say that because a person who was on my, like an internal, external on my committee for my dissertation said, you know, how can you write about the Caribbean if you've never been there? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I guess you're saying I should go. And so, you know, I applied for the funding, and it was 3 months that I lived in Trinidad at the University of West Indies and on campus. And I'd never lived in a dorm before. And that was the only time I ever lived in a dorm. And that was an interesting experience. But anyway, a dorm is a dorm is a dorm. But anyway, definitely I was like one of the only white people on campus, or at least like visually white looking person. And that was probably one of the first times I ever, like I think about my whiteness often, but it was the first time like I literally felt like I stuck out like a sore thumb. Like I was just glowing like in this way that sort of like, I don't fit in, you know, I'm clearly not from here or something like that. Although there's of course lots of white folks that live in the Caribbean, but so that was a really interesting, humbling experience. And having to navigate just the transportation systems there are totally different, and so on. And I think the thing that was really important for me was your point about listening. And it didn't matter how good my intentions were or how much reading I had done on anti-colonialism and all of this stuff. I think that talking to people, like where they live, and like listening to what they think and how they feel and stuff like that, there's no replacement for that. And like I was constantly surprised and sort of my mind was turned in all kinds of interesting ways just from talking to people. So, I mean, we know that there's a limitation when it comes to representation of any kind, but it really hit home when I was so grateful for that person, that professor who said, you need to travel to understand this. And I think when you study literature, we're not always encouraged to do that. We're encouraged to go to the archives, right? Or we're encouraged to do a research trip that involves books, not a research trip that involves people and culture and living culture. And because I'm not a social scientist, right? But it was invaluable to just, and it certainly doesn't perfect my understanding of anything, but I feel like that's the kind of thing that's changed my life. It's made my research meaningful, and it allows me to bring things to the classroom that I couldn't have brought at all, you know, in the past. So yeah, definitely important.
And it's a shorthand if you don't go there, but it's a longhand if you have, right? There's something about being there that sort of inscribes the experience on your body almost and in your mind so that you can share those anecdotes with the class, and it vivifies everything that you're talking about in a way that's so engaging with students. And I often tell people that I'm a professor, and people say, oh, ivory tower academic, and you don't have your feet on the ground, you're not very practical, you just navel gaze, and you've got to get your hands dirty. And what does it all mean? It's got to have some application in the world. And I agree to a great extent that if we've had the privilege of all of this education, that we do deserve to give the people who are in our classrooms the respect of making it mean something for them in a way that applies to their own lives. And so seeing things through their own lens and through our lenses of experience are really vital, I think, to all of that. And I know your career trajectory was determined to be an academic, I think, from the outset, and you pursued that really diligently with all of these wonderful experiences, making it that much more rich. My intention was not to be an academic. It was to go into publishing and to be an editor. First, I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and that's why I went to journalism, and that was going to take way too long, and I'd have to work at all these little tiny papers and work my way up for years, and I was too impatient for that. But in the process of taking my degree at Carleton, I fell in love with radio. And I started my own show at CHLY, CKCU, I should say, that was called Write On, interviewing writers of Canadian fiction and poetry. And I, in the process of that, met so many authors and agents and publishers who told me about jobs. And I did it for 5 years. And everything that they told me about led to a paying career in publishing. But first it was an unpaid position in publishing, covering reading series, reviewing for the Ottawa Citizen, going on CBC and talking about my top 3 favorite books, working as a publicist for the Ottawa Valley Book Festival, you know, being an agent's reader for some incoming manuscripts. And all of that filled out a resume so that when I decided to move to BC, I got my first job in publishing at Beach Holme, which was here on Vancouver Island in Victoria. But within about 8 months of that, I got an acceptance to a PhD because I thought, what else? What happens if I don't find a job? If all else fails, go back to school. And I had done a master's in Canadian studies after the journalism degree in Ottawa. So I decided maybe I could do both. And I moved the company to Vancouver and did my PhD while working full time,
Wow.
which is why it's still not complete. The coursework was complete in a year and the exams were complete in a year and the writing of the first draft a couple of years, but then it stagnated while I got more interested in publishing works of fiction and poetry, not only for adults by Canadian authors, but also for young adults. And I got seconded or headhunted over to launch a fiction list at Raincoast, which was the Harry Potter publisher at the time. And they had all kinds of J.K. Rowling money to spend. So like Robin Hood, I convinced them to spend it on Canadian lit and did that for 2 years before they sort of changed their mind and decided to go back to straight distribution. I went to Toronto and worked for 4 years at ECW as their literary nonfiction editor. And then when I came back to BC 4 years later, I worked in online publishing for 4 or 5 years. And then the position at VIU came up, and I'd been teaching on the side at SFU and Ryerson all along. But in wanting to be a single parent and adopt my son, I moved to the island in the hopes of setting up a sort of more stable daytime timeline so that I could be with him. And then I would freelance edit on the side, which is what had been my main sort of career role up until then. So I inverted the order of things and have been at VIU now for 10 years. So all of those experiences, though, I bring to my classes with students who are interested about magazine and book publishing, because I did work on ARC and Subterrane and Room literary magazine.
Oh, so cool. Wow. Yeah.
So they, you know, they want to know, are you just reading me something from a textbook, or did you live this? Can you vouch for it? You know, is it still the case today? And because I still freelance on the side, I can be a bit more legitimate. But I think that experience that you bring from the Caribbean and from your other life experiences to the books that you're teaching, so that the whole class can be more than an armchair traveler through literature, is really exciting. And your experiences academically also obviously are inspiring to people who want to go on to grad school, and you can talk to them about that part of your life. Have you had students ask you things that you've been able to pull all the other aspects of your life experience into and answering? And I think it humanizes us, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I think whether it's been volunteer work where I've worked with youth and overseas on sustainable development projects, or through living in Trinidad for 3 months and then doing some traveling on the side, and living in a dorm, frankly, with, you know, young students from all over the Caribbean who are just starting out university, and also working with mentors who are, Caribbean academics, as well as sort of mid-career Caribbean academics. So it allows me to have all these intergenerational perspectives, like really, really kind of lucky. And of course, that's just one time and place, and it doesn't represent like all of a Caribbean perspective by any means, but it allows me to at least make connections faster, I think, between certain kinds of conversations that are being had. And then also, like, some of my background is in African-American literature as well. So definitely with Black Lives Matter in the last couple of years, I've noticed a lot of my students take a much more vocal interest in anti-racism and anti-Black racism in particular. So I think that background has been useful. It's, of course, I'm white, so I can't speak from a Black experience, but at least some of the interactions I've had and education I've had and travels I've had allow for a little bit of an ability to point out connections, I think, in ways that I think could be helpful to them. And I think you're right about having grounded examples so that people can connect with that. Because one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately, especially as we're teaching in this strange time remotely in many ways, is how important it is to see everybody as a whole person and not just as like the student who's taking an English class, like, or value them just because they could be a potential English major. Like that person could be so important in business. They could be so important in healthcare. Who knows what they're going to do with their careers? And if you can try to make a connection with them to the material that's valuable to their own life trajectory, I think that's the most important thing in the whole world. So I think trying to see people as whole people when you're teaching involves in part finding ways with the course content that they can that they can see a connection. And it's not going to always be, look at this beautiful symbol on page 12, it's going to be some of the background that they don't see in the story, for example, immediately.
And educating that 360-degree person, right? Really thinking about how to create humans in the world that are going to make a better place, challenging them to be critical and to be thinking about the value that they can add outside of their career as well as within their career.
Yeah.
And certainly in our positions as status of women, we've had so many opportunities to meet both students and faculty thinking about what does feminism mean in 2020? How is it operationalized, right? How do we live our life out there really aware of the whole gender spectrum and equality and equity and seeing each other as valuable humans in every situation with equal rights? Those kinds of ideas, I find our students are hungry to talk about them as they are to talk about race in this particular moment. And maybe it's all because we're inside in our silos thinking about the world being out there. It's been a very reflective time, particularly on sort of capital F feminism and even what that word means. I remember thinking about when was the first time I used that word to describe myself? And it was probably 1987, 88. I had just been first year university. I was working as a lifeguard at Carleton to pay my bills because I didn't have help from my parents at the time or any scholarships. And I needed to bring in money about 20 hours a week. So I was working on a team of young 20-somethings at the pool a lot. And one of the women named Siobhan, I will always remember her, said, I overhear you talking sometimes in the office about being a feminist. Are you sure you want to say that out loud? And, what do you really mean by that? That means you hate men, right? And of course, I didn't hate men. Not only do I have a father and brothers and a boyfriend and lots of male friends, but I did hate the inequality that I saw pretty consistently in many experiences shared by my peers, but also in reading about women historically in my women's studies class. I finally found this vocabulary for what I had been feeling growing up in dozens of small towns as a young woman and the only girl in my family. My mother wasn't quite aware of the feminist divide because of her upbringing. My father was more so, interestingly. And really, I couldn't say that he was an early feminist, but he was less sexist than you'd expect him to be, I guess, at that age, which is not setting the bar high enough. But it was an opportunity for me to kind of articulate what it was that I was experiencing and then connect to all these other women on campus and elsewhere. And it was also about a year or two later that the Montreal massacre happened. And that was a pivotal moment for me as a university student, a woman 2 hours away, imagining if Marc Le Pen had come to Carleton and into my building, and that, gendered violence was the first time I really thought, not only does it happen historically, but it happens right now, right here. And I can't be a bystander in this. So I talked to my friend Siobhan about those things later, because we worked together for several years. And I hope that if she were ever to listen to this video, she too would say, that was a moment for me as well. And I have been mentored by many women in lots of different ways, but certainly calling myself a feminist is a badge of pride. It's not anything I would utter and under my breath. And I think you likely feel the same way. What was the moment that you kind of crystallized some of these ideas for you?
Well, I think it's an interesting point about having the language to articulate it, because I think the seeds were planted early on, seeing my mom as, you know, as a single mom advocating for herself, and also the union work that she was involved in the Canadian auto industry. But I don't think I ever remember her using the word feminism. And I think that, or feminist. And I think, I mean, certainly there's a long activist tradition and grassroots tradition associated with feminism, but there's also a lot of ways in which feminism gets articulated in a really academic way, which she wouldn't have had access to. So this is kind of funny, but like, it was when I read the 19th century slave narrative by Harriet Jacobs in undergrad. And basically when I learned about how she had to write the slave narrative in a way for white middle-class women so that they would actually care about her as a woman, and also maybe join the cause of abolition. That story basically said to me, I am a feminist, but I don't want to be the white feminist that she's writing to. And I don't want to be the kind of person that upholds these values of purity and chastity and a sort of white bourgeois perspective of what it is to be a woman. And so essentially, I think reading that and learning about that history is basically the moment that said, I'm going to define what matters to me, but it's against what I've just encountered. And it's not the kind of person I want to be, not the kind of feminism that is for me. So what kind of feminism is for me? And for me, like, and I'm trying to explore other kinds of feminism as well, but I mean, in terms of academic and political history and stuff, certainly Black feminists have been the most influential to me. And it's been the starting point of every way that I look at sort of issues of intersectionality and inequality. So I guess perhaps that could be problematic at times, for sure, but it's been a motivator. So class struggle and anti-racism sort of have been always the two questions that enter my mind first whenever I think of an issue as feminist. Of course, there also being the factor of gender and sexuality as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think now that we're both mothers of young children, I am the mother of a 5-year-old boy. You're a mother of a nearly 2-year-old girl. And thinking about what feminism will mean for them, right? What kind of world are we creating for them? What kind of world will they join and make better? How will they be in the world, whether they're partners or not? How will they be when they're thinking about hiring women, if they're in that position, or being hired? What is the freedom that we want them to have, the control over their minds and bodies that men enjoy? What kinds of issues are sort of front of mind? And I think about that a lot, having had a unhappy romantic history. I really want to raise a man who understands how women work in the world and need support, and to cherish them and to support them in all of the same aspirations that men may have. And that, you know, he doesn't lose his sensitive, sweet, tender side in the process of growing older, that he doesn't buy into that toxic masculinity that we're having so many conversations about and is still so visible from the White House on down. We want to really think about, for me, you know, as a feminist, raising a feminist man, and raising a man who, a boy into a man who is attentive to seeing the differences and spotting that equality and standing up for it and being part of the solution. And even though he's 5, he's been to 3 marches with me already.
Amazing.
We have had many a conversation, and I'm so happy to say that, you know, though he's in a class now of kindergarten children, 6 girls and 4 boys, there's never any question that the girls and boys can play with the same toys, can choose careers that are counter to what used to be gender stereotypes. And he has one of his best friends is a girl also from Vietnam. And there's this sort of assumption that all things are created equal, except that, of course, when they play together and some of their choices have appear gendered, despite all of those attempts at neutrality. And so there are opportunities to have those conversations. And I really look forward to seeing how he asks questions and what his own answers will be, and how he contributes to this. Because I think being like yourself, being raised by who I hope is a strong single mom, that he'll have real empathy for women who have to do that. Many of whom are out in the world. Is that the kind of thing you want to impart to Sophia?
Well, right down to things like, should I be calling Sophia she? Actually, I mean, everything is kind of in my mind still. Like, I want her to be whoever she wants to be, and whether she's they or he or she. So we're starting with she, and we're going to see what she gravitates towards, and I'm totally flexible in that regard. So it's right even down to that, where I'm just like, I want her to be whoever she wants to be. I also want her to be a feminist, but I think it's about giving her those tools to like ask questions about the world, right? Because ultimately I can do whatever I want to try to influence her, but I'm guessing like my child is still pretty close to home, so not exposed to the world in a range of ways, that eventually she's going to take her own detours and ask her own questions and make her own decisions. And so I can only kind of give her the tools to ask good, empathetic questions, to notice things about the world. And, you know, right now it's, you know, just to kind of cut it short, but to kind of just encapsulate it in a little moment, she's really into saying, what's that, all the time right now. And she hears little sounds in the house and she wants to know what everything is. And I think it's so adorable, but also just like so great, because, you know, right from, you know, when she was pre-verbal, you know, we would say, oh, do you hear what that sound is? That's the sound of a bird chirping. Do you notice that? Do you notice that? And just trying to make sure that she's awake and aware. And I think that is a really good starting point for something. But yeah, I mean, I think this is like, I'm living day to day, trying to like give her what I can, but you know, I have no idea what balls she's going to throw at me. So I don't know. I mean, I hope for safety. I hope for security. I hope that she's not a selfish person, in the sense that I hope that her safety and security is always connected to the desire for safety and security of other people, whether they're women or not. And so those are sort of my desires and hopes and aspirations for her in that way. In terms of the word feminist, I have thought a little bit about that as well. Like that word's very important to me. But I think historically for various groups of people, that word has had been problematic, not just from people who are patriarchal, but I think like there is the sense that it's academic, or that it's white, or that, you know, but I think the important part is to make sure we remember there are these important long histories and traditions that are feminist, even if they didn't always use that word, that come from a range of places. And so there can be a range of vocabulary potentially to get where we need to go. And that's the most important thing, although I do think that word is pretty important to me. Yeah, and this kind of makes me think a little bit too, since we're on the topic of children, is thinking about COVID-19 and the pandemic and the ways that our routines have been sort of unsettled, and we've had to adjust and change. And I'm just wondering if you might sort of like share a little bit about the daily life, what daily life is like for you and your family right now, and sort of what you're hoping for women, or even for your child, like if once we eventually hopefully move beyond the pandemic.
Well, I think that connectedness that you were talking about and the unselfishness is so important to hold on to. We don't want them to be less aware. We
Mhm.
don't want them to live in fear and terror of the capital V
Yeah.
virus. My
Yeah.
son calls it the stupid virus. And it is making his life circumscribed, but not in ways that are compromising his health in any way, or even his mental health. I think partially because we have been trying to use the time to play during the first 3 months of it. We must have built, a million Lego enterprises and Playmobil and cardboard box robots. And we were locked into each other. It was kind of a second mat leave almost. And we really that was one of the upsides, to have that time together at a later age in his whole growth experience. But it was also a chance to talk about how lucky we were to be healthy and to be able to reach through technology to talk to people, because we're both very extroverted people. And so the impinging on our social schedules was probably the harshest part of it. We really missed seeing other people in person.
I know.
And I think, we've had conversations about other people whose lives have been much harder than ours, not only elsewhere in Canada, but around the world. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with respect to feminism and the pandemic has been around domestic violence and being locked in a house or any sort of space with someone who is abusive, and having nowhere to go and no access to social services that were beyond the end of a telephone, where you would escape to, how you would support yourself, whether or not that would become a new normal that might condition you to stay long after you really needed to leave for your own physical and mental health, which is of course something we'd seen before the pandemic. But the numbers, not only of divorces, which may or may not have had anything to do with abuse or domestic abuse, the numbers that we're also seeing in terms of women reporting aggressive behavior from partners has been shocking to me. And it does act as an imprisoning with your captor, right? With someone you're terrified of. And having had the opposite experience with my son, of course, being with someone I loved so much for so long, the contrast was really palpable to me. And I am concerned, especially the longer the pandemic goes on, and potentially going through another dark winter, what that will mean for women who have nowhere to go. So I think that's got to be a priority for us. And it is something that I want to be a part of the solution if I can. And we need to ask those kinds of questions, I think. Have you been thinking about the kinds of applications of our role here as status of women and just women in a community where we know that that's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're quite, I literally came off my maternity leave and it was back in the classroom for like 2 months. And then it was back home again. So there was that extended maternity leave, and I really value that family time. But I think that I was really disappointed in a way because, like a lot of people, I was really afraid of what the pandemic was, and we knew a lot less about it then than we know now. And so I was kind of shocked and into immobility, and I was living in a safe, happy environment. So I can only imagine the kind of immobility some people might have felt as a result of being exposed to people who maybe are going through drug addiction, violence, mental health issues. Like certainly more people are confronted by mental health issues, as well as I said, addiction and violence. So there's a range of things that people are going through. And even I was a bit fearful. And I think, I know we're in the second wave now, but I feel like I'm more used to, unfortunately, the situation. And now I feel a little more prepared mentally to shift, too late, but shift back into thinking more about what can we be doing for our community. So, obviously the Zoom In series is something just in general that I think is important I think it's important for intimate conversations between women to be had and shared, and seeing each other's faces matters, even if it's remotely like this. And I hope to be able to connect with a lot of other women around the island for this series. I was thinking about also trying to do more to feature small businesses run by women on the island through my role. And I know that's just a small action, but I was just thinking about, local industries are really taking a huge hit. And we know that in Nanaimo, if we don't have those, I don't know what we have. No, I'm just kidding. But, like, it's really important, some of our local businesses here. And so if there's a way to reach out to small businesses and female entrepreneurs, that would be really important to me. And then, of course, connecting with like the frontline organizations that are helping the most vulnerable women and gender minorities is really crucial. And I've been talking to Haven about what their needs are for Christmas donations, because of course they have to modify what they can ask for in the situation. And I think there's just a new learning process, because outreach is going to look a little different under these conditions, but I'm finally mentally and emotionally prepared. I actually do think so, to finally make that shift. And I feel bad, to be quite candid, for how long it has taken me to feel ready to get back in that sort of environment, to be helping and reaching out. I don't know, I was afraid. And but I hope that's going to change now.
Yeah, I can understand. I think our friends are exemplary of a whole spectrum of responses, right? From people whose lives didn't change dramatically. They followed the rules, but they, essentially went about their business within the proposed parameters. Then there are people who were the anti-maskers and who, said, I refuse to have any part of my life impinged upon by this hoax of a pandemic. And then the people who really stayed inside and who changed virtually every aspect of their life in order to remain safe in their own minds. And they had different standards of what that safety looked like than other people did. So it was always a negotiation, but I think it's an act of imagination and empathy to say, well, how are you feeling? And your feelings are legitimate. And, do you need help? And whether that's an organization or an individual, if you feel that you have the capacity to help, then I hope that people do so. And if they need help, I hope that they ask. It's that imagination that makes me sometimes think about, totally different careers that we might have, would have been like my parents, and to act in a sort of charitable capacity, and to combine that with travel in some ways. That's very appealing. To go back to my radio roots and to be able to talk about books and have Eleanor Wachtel's job, that's pretty exciting. Or to travel in some other capacity and get paid for it as a travel writer and reviewer. All of that would be appealing. Slightly more challenging with a child, obviously. But I think to have a career that still allows me access to almost all of those things in some capacity at different times in my life is just a gift in itself. And I do sometimes pretend I'm a totally different person. What would I do? I would be, I could sing, for one thing. I couldn't sing a note right now. I couldn't carry a tune in a paper bag. But, all those, that stretching of our imagination also lets us to stretch so far that we can embrace other people's whose lives are so different from our own. You ever play that game where you imagine who you would be if you weren't a university professor?
Oh, like every day. No, I'm just kidding. Well, I'm kidding, not kidding. I'm very lucky, I think, to be in this position, and also because of the kind of unique university that we're at. I think there is some value in terms of the practical, industry-based, volunteer-based. There's value in other kinds of work, not just sort of academic work, even though academic work is also important. But I was gonna say, this whole pandemic situation has made me feel more present than ever, because I feel like I'm constantly trying to pay attention to what's going on. And so thinking about the future and alternatives, I think this idea of a stretch of imagination is super important. And so I hope there are ways that I can help create or make those connections with women and hear like the range of things that women need, because not every woman needs the same thing, right? And I think that's an important thing to think about. And so this sort of question of what would you be otherwise, I'm trying to think of what are my other needs are in life, you know? And I do feel the need to sing, and I really wish I could be a rock star, but I honestly, that's absolutely never going to happen, because I, like you, cannot carry a tune, though my daughter does appreciate my version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. But I mean, I don't trust documentaries in a lot of ways, but I've always been driven by the visual and also by the power of film. And so I think there's a part of me that would love to be like a rock star filmmaker of documentaries if I could. And with that in mind, I suppose, you know, at my dinner table, if I wanted to invite two women, living or not, maybe it seems a little cliche, but I'd love to have dinner with Susan Sontag and with Audre Lorde. The reason being is both of them write in a really documentary way. And of course, Susan Sontag was really fascinated by documentary and photography as well. And they both they also write a lot about health and politics. And what I love about their writing is that they explore the politics of documentary, yet they also participate in documentary writing. And they theorize in a way that's available to the public. I feel like it's much more of a public intellectual role that they take on in their writing than sort of a high theorist that, you know, to understand them, you need to have 12 degrees. And to me, that is such an important thing for grassroots movement building, is to be able to read material that's accessible to more people. It's maybe not accessible to everyone, I get that, but that's super powerful. And so they're sort of like role model people that are also connected to my desire to be a rock star documentarian. So I'm wondering, like, what about are there people at your dinner table that you would like to? You're great at having hosting dinner parties, by the way. So who would you host if you could?
Gosh, the list could be endless, but I was thinking when you were talking about the woman who got up at the Oscars and said, you know what category you're in when your dress costs more than your film. And she was a documentary filmmaker. And
that's good.
At one point kind of appalled at the amount that was spent on fashion and jewels and hairstyling compared to what she had as a budget to tell a really important story in her documentary. And then few numbers of female directors and documentarians that there are, happily that number is growing, and it's I think making an important difference in the films that are available to us and the topics that are covered. But if I were to have a dinner party, as somebody who reads so much and who appreciates the power of storytelling, I'm probably drawn to women who have written fiction. But the first two names that came to me when you just asked that question, if I was sort of on the spot, I think Mother Teresa. I just am fascinated by her selflessness and her ability to really walk the walk in terms of embracing people that other people had forgotten about and given them permission to forget about. And I just find it such an incredible example. I think about all the micro payment kind of models that have come out of India, and part, I think, stemming back to her ideas about empowering women in communities and in their own homes and giving them skills that would allow them to be seen. And they, of course, don't leave, but stay with their children and hopefully raise them also with those ideals. So she's a fascinating person to me. And I think for my own feminism, since we've been on that topic, reading Ms. Magazine and Gloria Steinem has been very influential to me, because I have always worked in the magazine world, and as a writer and editor, I am fascinated by how a magazine like that can be vital in the world and be such a touchstone for a movement and organization. And I've read her own stories of her life, and though you know, she's a controversial figure in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
I do think she also democratized feminism in a way, and she did allow us to talk about it in a way that wasn't less powerful, but it was less intimidating.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we need if we're going to make
Yep.
feminists of men, who
Yep.
we need to truly bring equality about in
Mm-hmm.
the world. And there's, every time I turn on the news today, there's examples of places in which there's so much work for feminists to do, male and female, from the RCMP's recent report on sexism and homophobia and racism in their ranks, to discussions about Indigenous women who have been abused in hospital spaces during this pandemic,
Oh,
to
I know. Oh,
so many other stories around the world of women who have not been heard. Their
yeah.
voices have been silenced. So I think the more heroes we
Mm-hmm.
have, the better. And we have to recognize that they may not ever write books or documentaries, but they are heroes nonetheless. Some of the most incredible advances have been made from people who never get a byline.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so true. Absolutely. And so how do we understand that? I guess, do we just know that those people exist, or do we try to find a way to spotlight those folks? Or what do you think about, like, what do we do with that knowledge that there's lots of people that just won't be acknowledged for the important work that they do, but we want to keep, I guess, cultivating that kind of person in the world?
Well, sometimes I think about the assignments that we give our students. You know, those
Yeah.
are academic opportunities for them to take a question like this and explore it in their own essays, or to do presentations on video or audio or podcast, or
Yeah.
you know, some way in which they can bring to us their heroes and the people who are important to them, their mentors, on the issue of feminism or any other, and share it with even a class of 30 other students, or within a department, or within a university, or of course the minute you put it online,
Yeah.
with global audiences, right? And we all have this power to be broadcasters now, as you're doing. And a series like this that focused on people in our own community who have made incredible contributions but may not have been recognized for them, is one way of modeling that we want to hear from those people, and we value them, and there are ways to recognize them even if they didn't want to be on camera. I think it's important that the people around them respect and appreciate and thank them for the work that they're doing, because it is so much unpaid labor in so many ways that also is more likely to be done by women. And I think there are stories, so many stories, that we just need to continue to listen for.
And invisible labor, as you said, not just unpaid, but like, you know, we talk a lot about emotional labor, but just there's these so many incalculable things sometimes. There's this image, I can't think of the artist right now, that she does a lot of pictures of what it looks like to be a parent out in the public versus what it looks like behind the scenes. And so there's this image of like a mom with looking put together with the stroller, and then the other image beside it is like a million different shots of her in millions of different positions, holding millions of different things, crying, sweating, getting paint all over her, like just sort of the messiness of life. And those things are not always valued, and we know that as women, time and time again. I was going to say, sort of as a parting note, that I'm usually a pessimist, and I'm struggling with the encouragement of important people in my life to turn that around and to try to be more of an optimist, which is an odd time to choose that. But with that in mind, the sort of image that I've seen in something I read years ago, dealing with what happens when capitalism falls apart and there's cracks in a system. And this particular writer, whose name escapes me right now, but suggests that when we start to see the cracks in a system, one of the things that's really important is through those cracks, light comes through. And I think that, you know, this is a really important opportunity for all of us. Who knows how long this is going to last in terms of our pandemic culture. But I hope that we don't forget how this felt. I hope that we don't forget some of the lessons we're learning. So, because I think there's some pretty intense self-reflection that a lot of people are being forced to do, whether they like it or not. And I guess one of my biggest hopes is just that there is that opportunity for creative stretches of the imagination and to find new ways to do things differently. And as you use that example of students maybe presenting things in the way that they want to present them, like that we don't always create predetermined models for how you can express an idea or show that you've learned something. You know, if that flexibility becomes possible, then so many other things become possible. Things we can't even anticipate could happen in such a great way. And so I hope that's the trajectory we're on going forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
agree. I think we have to find hope in this situation because we are still several months out of a vaccine. We are going into a Christmas holiday period, whether you're a religious person or not, that is usually associated with hope and light and togetherness. And even though we may not be more than 4 or 5 people in our households this Christmas, we still can see, I think, an opportunity to celebrate the unexpected, right? And that if people have the ingenuity to find a vaccine that will fight this virus, then we have the ingenuity to do all kinds of other things. And I think particularly on the environmental front, the break that this period has given the planet and the absolute priority of that going forward, the ability to see clear skies and clear oceans and to hear the wildlife in a way that we haven't because of the roar of traffic or the blare of lights, you know, the opportunity to find peace in that quietude in a world without us in it all the time, 24/7, making it dirty and messy and unlivable for ourselves and for our children. I think that lesson is one of the ones that I hope is the strongest of this pandemic. And from that desire to save each other comes all of these other important, as you said, intersectional connections about how we can work together so that our life on the other side of this pandemic is just not a return, but is really a reinvention.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautifully said. I just want to thank you so much. I'm so grateful to have met you. I'm grateful to have you in my life, whether it's virtually or not. You're like the most generous, one of the most generous, sweetest, insightful people I've ever met, and very smart and like expert in so many things that I'm not. So I learn from you all the time, and I know our time's valuable. And I just thank you so much for taking this time with me today, and I'm so glad that you were the first person that got to be a part of this. So I think maybe we'll close this and wish everybody a wonderful holiday, and also to a much more hopeful and inspiring 2021. Thanks so much, Joy.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.